It's great to have all you guys with us. I'm John Stone Street. I'm a speaker and fellow with the Colson Center, one of the voices of Breakpoint and The Point and some others. And as you know, one of the things that Chuck Colson was most passionate about was helping Christians think well about the culture. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. And of course, because the fish doesn't know anything else. I told that illustration to a group of students a couple years ago, and I said, why wouldn't you ask the fish? And they said, because fish can't talk. I said, that's not exactly what I'm after. The point is that...
But still appropriate.
It was true. It was just... Anyway, this is the sort of thing Ed would say. Yes. But what the point of that parable is when you're in water, you don't recognize that you're wet. When you're in culture, we don't actually always recognize, what culture is doing to us. The great Princeton theologian, founder of Westminster Seminary, J. Gresham Machen, also said something similar. I mean, he was a staunch Calvinist, and he said that the greatest obstacle to the spread of the gospel are bad ideas that are embedded in culture. And that's a powerful thing for a Calvinist to say. These guys here are two friends of mine, Ed Stetzer, president of Lifeway Research, and Warren Smith with World News Group, vice president of World News Group, and a columnist, commentator, just started a great new program, kind of an NPR-ish sort of radio program. And guys that I've worked with and thought with these sorts of questions about. And what we want to talk about is, what is it like to impact and shape culture? And we wanted to apply it specifically to media. As we know, millions and millions of dollars are spent every year on Christian initiatives. Chuck Colson, I think, said this. I've been trying to find the source of it, and I can't find it even in our own archives. But I think at one point he said, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is there are more Christians than ever before. The bad news is it doesn't seem to be making any difference. That was a little bit of a harsh statement because obviously we know that Christianity makes a difference in individual hearts and lives. But is there a call that's bigger than that? And what would it look like for Christian media to move the needle of culture and what we might call the cultural imagination? So it's just a conversation that we thought that we wanted to have. And so these are two guys that were friends of mine, and we've talked about it offline, and both of them have done extensive work in this area. In different ways, and so I just thought we want to have this conversation out loud. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes here, the three of us talking, but we don't want it to be a one-way conversation. We absolutely want it to be a conversation with the entire room. So after we kind of talk, we want you to join in the conversation. I want to point your attention to Bill Reitler. Bill is with us at Ambassador Advertising. He's got a microphone, and when the time comes, you can just get his attention. We want to get everything we can recorded in our tape. Unless you say anything that you want to be off record, and then, well, I don't know what to do. Wrong room. Yeah, well, you can bribe me later to get it, or bribe him. So yeah, but anyway, that's kind of my initial statement. I want these guys to kind of throw out a couple thoughts here, and we'll go back and forth on it, on what it looks like, the role of Christian media to shape culture. What could that possibly be? Is it possible? I'll give you one more illustration to kind of kick the ball off here. I've only agreed with Vice President Joe Biden once in my entire life, I think. I think it was just once, and that's when he said that Will and Grace taught us more about same-sex marriage than any politician has and any philosopher has. I think that's probably right. I'm actually doing a lot of research in this area right now for a book project. Absolutely right. The cultural imagination, at least on this issue, for example, was way upstream of the political decisions, I think. They work hand in hand. But these are the sorts of conversations we need to have. What would it look like if secular media was so successful moving the needle? Could Christian media be successful in the same sort of way? So, Ed, you're off. Thoughts?
I agreed with a couple of other more things than Joe Biden. One of them that something was a big deal. I just didn't think it was always a good big deal. One of the things I was struck by, we've been talking about media, things of that sort. I think about CNN aired the documentary Blackfish. 1.36 million people watched it. Other places, it got about 2.3 million viewers. That's a very small percentage of the population. Warren's magazine will be read by hundreds of thousands. I'll host a TV program tonight or Friday that they say they have about 300,000 to 500,000 actual viewers. Together, we would have more than 2 million people on a regular basis, and yet Blackfish is the topic of discussion all over. I think it kind of points to the reality that Christian media is also often isolated and ghettoed, sometimes talking to ourselves, and we're trying to ask what we might do differently. And I think that's an important conversation to have. Warren will have more to say on that, but just as you asked, I'll just share just a couple of things. Part of the reality is we don't need some things in Christian media. We don't need misinformation. We don't need demagoguery. We don't need to constantly appeal to something that draws clicks but's not right. And I think that's an issue in a lot of Christian media. We have this thing in the back of our brain called the reticular activating system. It causes us to notice some things and not notice others. We notice things that are unique or different or dangerous. And we don't notice, for example, the quiet humming of the laptop over here. We don't notice the quiet talking of people in the hallway behind us. But we would notice if something was very different or threatening. And you can build a media empire on calling out things that are different and threatening. And what it does is it ultimately causes people to eventually be isolated from facts and isolated from reality and not be impacting the culture as a whole. So we don't need, I think, media that's doing those kinds of things, tickling our ears, amusing ourselves to death. But I do think that we do need Christian media as part of the solution for the future in which we find ourselves. Now, you and I recently talked about ways to engage culture. I think media is part of that. I think Christian media can teach us to engage culture well, to think about how we're engaging culture. And I think there's different ways to do that. I'm fascinated by, my wife listens to K-Love all the time. But what's fascinating to me is, my wife's a Christian, not surprisingly, but I have a neighbor who's not a believer who listens to K-Love because of the positive, uplifting messages that they advertise all the time. That's a path they've taken. I do a monthly spot with Moody on kind of Moody Radio. Where are we in culture? What are stats? And we kind of talk about the state of where we are so we can better inform people. I think that's a way to do it. I think ultimately, when we write things that help us to understand culture, but then also, my field is missiology. My PhD is in missiology. I want us to understand so we might engage it both faithfully and fruitfully for the cause of the gospel. I think Christian media should help us demonstrate how to create culture. I think one of the things that I like about the Colson Center is the idea that we're not simply responding to, though some, that's part of their job, that's part of their role. Warren is going to be a reporter. That's part of what he'll do is report on. But we need Christians who are actually creating culture that shows a better way, shows a different way. Not the cheesy stuff. But I do think, I think a lot of us sort of have a high cheesy factor meter. And I think we need to be careful about that because something doesn't have to be a $200 million Hollywood production to impact a lot of lives. But I think we need more, not less, of that sort of culture creation. I was watching recently a preview of Mom's Night Out, and Patricia Heaton and Sean Austin and some others, and wasn't an explicitly Christian film. There was no altar call at the end. It was funny. People laughed throughout it. It portrayed Christians in a positive light, in which we don't see a lot. And so I think partly is to kind of be in that culture creation space. That means New York, that means LA, that means Nashville. That means being in that culture creation space. The guy goes to my church. He's the country music songwriter of the year, 2 of the last 3 years. And the songs he writes kind of speak to the values that he holds. And lastly, I think we need to speak to how prophetically we can speak to the culture itself. And I think that takes wisdom. I don't think the fact that the clerk at Walmart doesn't wish you Merry Christmas means that Christians are being persecuted and you should snarl back, Jesus is the reason for the season, when they say Happy Holidays. I don't think that's helpful. But I do think there are real issues, and sometimes they get kind of pushed away by fake issues. I noticed a few months ago, the Army's going to court-martial soldiers who share their faith with one another, which was totally not what the person said. It's not what the source of the story said. But this kind of went crazy all over Christian media. Nobody bothered to check. I write a blog series now that I hate to do, but it's called Another Day, Another Faux Christian Controversy. And what I would say, there are real issues right now in the military. How are chaplains going to hold their values about marriage? And several denominations have said we can't do this. And this is new territory. And when we're raising false alarms, it's hard to raise real alarms. Not everything is a crisis, but there are real issues and real religious liberty issues that have to be addressed. So for me, I want Christian media that teaches to engage culture, demonstrates how to create culture, and speaks to how to prophetically speak into culture. And I hope that's part of what we'll see more and more in the days months and years to come.
Warren, why don't you go there?
Well, I'd like to begin by, talking to the question, is it possible for media to change the culture, for Christian media in particular to change the culture, by citing an example from history that I think answers that question with an emphatic yes. It's the story of a newspaper that was founded by a Bible-believing Christian. His name was Henry Raymond. That newspaper was in a major city in the United States. Several years after the newspaper was founded, this crusading newspaper decided to crusade against abortion and sent one of its reporters, a man named Augustus St. Clair, undercover into the abortion clinic. Some of you know about Lila Rose and James O'Keefe and those guys going with video cameras into abortion facilities and then putting the videos on YouTube, but they weren't the first to do this. Augustus St. Clair was the first to do this. He went into the abortion facilities, exposed what was going on there, and because of the crusading journalism of this newspaper, abortion clinics all over New York City were closed, and in fact, one of the abortionists went to jail for 7 years. Some of you by now may be guessing that the newspaper I'm talking about is this great Christian newspaper I'm talking about is the New York Times. And I'm talking about an era in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, whenever it was, in fact, one of the great Christian newspapers of its day and was moving the needle culturally in the city of New York. I share that story with you because, A, I think a lot of people are surprised to discover that the New York Times had its founding by a Bible-believing Christian, and they crusaded against abortion. I share it with you also to let you know that I think it really is possible for journalism to move the needle, and to let you know that there is a rich tradition of Christian journalism in this country that has had a major impact on the culture. And that's what we are hoping to do at World, of course, is to try to stand in that rich tradition of Christian journalism. We do that by exercising what we call biblical storytelling. And biblical storytelling, as we define it, is storytelling that illuminates, or in some cases you might even say incarnates, the great meta-narrative of history, the great meta-narrative of the Bible, the great redemption story that we hear about in Scripture, which is that God created the world, but that man in his rebellion has created a fallen world. And that Jesus, however, has intervened in history and has redeemed the world, and that God is in the process of reconciling all things to himself. That great meta-narrative of history is what I think Christian journalism should be about. It should be about the process of finding stories that illuminate or incarnate that great meta-narrative. And I think that if Christian journalism would do that, on a regular basis, on a consistent basis, that it would have a very real chance of moving the needle culturally in this country and around the world.
Yeah. So, biblical storytelling, how do you make a story that, I mean, part of that is choosing stories, right? How do you choose the right stories to not react, not have false outrage against, right? How do you make that decision?
Well, that's a really great question. I think choosing the stories is absolutely essential. Storytelling, by the way, is the stock in trade of the postmodern, right? I mean, postmodernism is all about the story. It's all about my story, though. What's different between the postmodern version of storytelling and what I call biblical storytelling, or what we call biblical storytelling at World, is that, again, the stories that we choose illuminate, or in some cases I might even say incarnate, that great meta-narrative, the great biblical story, the story that says that Christ is indeed redeeming everything and restoring all things to himself. You know, John, I learned from you this about the philosopher Leotard, who said that one of the great characteristics, or one of the best definitions that he's ever seen of the postmodern age in which we live, is that postmoderns have extreme incredulity towards the meta-narrative. And so what I think the responsibility of Christian journalism is, a main responsibility of Christian journalism is to pick the right stories that do illuminate that great meta-narrative that turn people's eyes to what God is doing in the world.
I agree. I think also that one of the what's the word I'm looking for? One of the characteristics of postmodern media is that individual stories are autonomous. So my story, my feelings, my event, that's autonomous. There's no connection to any bigger story that's bigger than us. And I think Christians can be guilty of this. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think in conversion narratives, we're guilty of this. That somehow our experiences with God, we're guilty of this. That somehow, and again, testimony is so important in Scripture, even especially in Revelation. But at some level, Christians can be guilty in the media space of telling stories as if their stories are autonomous, that they're disconnected to the big story, even a conversion story. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, in fact, you mentioned Revelation and the power of testimony. One of my favorite verses is Revelation 12:11, and which says, they were overcomers by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony and by loving not their own lives even unto death. It's important to understand that our testimony is not all about us, but it's all about what God has done in our lives. And when we understand that the proper role of storytelling, especially for the Christian journalist, is illuminating the truth about the world,
right? Yeah,
God's world, then I think that we approach the whole process from a slightly different perspective, and we end up at a very different place.
Yeah. Well, and I agree. And I think an indication of the fact that our stories are not being connected to the larger story is what, Ed was talking about, these false controversies or the ones. I mean, there's real things to be concerned about. There's no doubt about it. Huge things to be concerned about. But when we act as if these things that are to be concerned about are the end of our lives, right? I mean, the despair and the outrage and all of that, there are things to be worked up and explained. But if we're connected to the big story, then we're going to be people of hope, not people of despair, right? We're going to be people that think, no, wait, the bigger story here is that Christ is risen from the dead. That's always the big story, right, on the backdrop.
You can't end every story in that. That would be a little creepy. But nonetheless, I do think it fits in a bigger narrative. I mean, if we look to Paul writes in Philippians, whatever's true, whatever's honorable, goes through, would think on these things. The problem is those things don't attract page views. Like outrage and scandal and things of that sort. And I think there has to be a place where Christian media leads and not simply responds to the outrage of the masses. I think many Christians in America sort of feel like America was founded. There was this compact between God and America, and I think that's a bit of a misreading of history. But there's a sense that's been lost, and we've lost our home field advantage. And there's a certain percentage that if they yell loud enough and get mad, like post on social media enough, everything has to be yelled about. And I would say Christian media can speak into that and say, how do we be winsome in the midst of this? How do we be honest? Because there are real religious liberty issues right now that are getting lost in fake religious liberty issues right now. How do we speak into that? Because I think the reason we maybe have less credibility on what I think is real, like the HHS mandate or things about whether certain types of business have to serve certain marriages which are uncomfortable, we've yelled about 50 other things. And so now it's like, well, it's just you yelling again. I think there are real issues, and I think Christian media needs to lead, not just follow.
It's hard because you and I also deal with all three of us have, Twitter conversations and Facebook conversations with, evangelicals that are ready to give up any sort of, critique of culture or any sort of, moral outrage of any sort of sense. And so it feels like sometimes you're pulled between two different reactions. One is that's Friedrich Nietzsche, I think, said, all truths are bloody truths to me, like everything's worth fighting and dying over. So you got that side, and then the other side saying, oh, no, it's no big deal. Anybody can serve anybody, and it's not going to hurt your religious... these are really bad false dichotomies.
John Francois Lyotard, Nietzsche, you're killing me. I'm going to have to bring some ancient philosopher. Let me... but what I would say is there are, and I think that's part of the job of Christian media, is to educate people to the difference. Yeah. And I think that's a maturity that I think sometimes is lacking in a lot of Christian media.
Well, I think one of the things that we have to do is to recover the art of storytelling. You mentioned Will and Grace a few moments ago in your one agreement with Joe Biden. Unfortunately, what Will and Grace taught us, Will and Grace did teach us, but what it taught us about marriage was wrong. And that's because part of the reason that though they won that argument was because there weren't Christians in the public square with a moral imagination, a biblical imagination, teaching other and different things about marriage. And I think that one of the Jesus in Mark 4, verse 34, the Bible says that, and Jesus did not speak to them except by parable. And it was a primary, way that Jesus communicated to the masses. Though it's also important that in private, Jesus would tell the disciples what he meant. So this is not this emphasis on storytelling is not to say that we don't care about doctrine, that we don't care about theology, that they are not important or shouldn't be primary. But it is a way of saying that mastering the art of storytelling is an essential way that we're going to move the needle on the public conversation.
Well, yeah, and it also underscores. And by the way, before I make this point, I want to if you want to jump in the conversation, we want you to jump in the conversation now. So go ahead and get Bill's attention. Where did Bill go? Oh, there he is. Yeah. Wave at Bill, and he'll bring the mic to you because we got about 25 minutes left or so of our conversation here. But I think that underscores the point that I think Christians have oftentimes tried to shape and change culture by having prophets only and no poets, right? So, in other words, as if we can just articulate our position, people will listen. And this is what Machen, I think, was trying to say, is that, in fact, he goes on in that quote that the greatest obstacle to the spread of the gospel are bad ideas embedded in culture. He said, you can preach with all the fervor of a reformer and only succeed in swaying a heart or two here or there, right? If you've lost the collective imagination of the culture. So you look at Will and Grace, what Will and Grace didn't do is preach. Right? When we get preached at, I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm getting preached at from a Christian movie or what was that in the secular green environmentalist end times movie?
Inconvenient Truth.
Inconvenient Truth, or even The Day After Tomorrow, right? Which was actually a story, but it was too preachy. If it's too preachy, it doesn't sway you, right? And so I think it underscores what Will and Grace did is it combined. The biggest thing was Will in that show was Cliff Huxtable from the Cosby Show. He was the one who solved the problems, right? So it was an embedded reality. It was an embodied reality. It wasn't preachy. And I just don't think preachiness works to shift culture without imagination.
And the quote I'll throw in, just so I need to have a quote so I fit with you guys. Ivan Illich, Ivan Illich talks about telling an alternative story that people are drawn to in the telling, and I think that's what we often lack right now. But I do see some bubbling in that interest in that area, and that's encouraging to me. We think of movies, we think of TV, things of that sort. Eric's talking about his TV show. We did a little interview yesterday. So I think there's some potential to break into the broader cultural setting.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Jump in, Mike.
The one thing regarding Will and Grace and a lot of the meta-narratives that we have here is that they begin with the acceptance of the lifestyle or whatever we're against. Mm-hmm. That's how they begin showing, like the Cliff Huxtable, what spurred on is that Will was the Cliff Huxtable. Will was the accepted person. It had nothing to do with his sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. What it was is that you guys are accepting me as a role model. Mm-hmm. Then once that acceptance happens, then the same-sex marriage issue, though not preachy, is all of a sudden the audience is more open to that because I'm accepting Will and that's the problem that we have as believers is that we have been unacceptable and our message has been unacceptable. We're not, and I like what Warren says, we don't have a biblical imagination of making it an acceptable alternative. In today's culture, we are now the alternative. We are not, the accepted norm. Everything else is the accepted norm. So now we have to be a little bit more creative in how do we become the accepted person within the entertainment or the arts or whatever.
Well, Mike. I think that's such a good point because one of the things that means is we're in a I don't want to say a unique place in history because everyone says that and it's probably only half the time true. Well, we oftentimes go, well, the early church was in a pagan culture and it was able to make a difference. Right, but the early church was building into a pagan culture. It wasn't trying to rebuild something it had lost. When you've lost something, you go from being the new guy to being the bad guy. You see what I'm saying? And that's a huge situation that we're in. We've talked about this on the level of marriage meeting Ed and I were at recently. We talked about this. One of the languages is language is really important, right? I think the battle of ideas in a culture is often the battle over language and definitions and things like that. And one of the things that I think is important is as long as we use this term, let's preserve traditional marriage. If we just take that one issue, right? This generation doesn't have any idea what that could possibly mean. Traditional marriage doesn't mean to them what it means to many of us. It certainly doesn't have good connotations very often, right? There's little reflections of it, like the show maybe Parenthood, where family is still respected, But in most situations, traditional, it's less about preserving, and it's got to be about rebuilding or building. And there's a difference between a cultural approach that tries to protect something that's being lost and something that's trying to rebuild something that's not there anymore.
And to do so simultaneously, though, because we're still trying to protect
still
things
trying
that are
to
being
hold
lost.
some lines. Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah, David.
One thing that I'm concerned about in this discussion is we're talking about speaking to the secular world amongst a bunch of people who don't speak to the secular world. Christian media speaks to the Christian world, just as an empirical matter. I mean, how many of us, when you write for a specifically intentionally Christian publication, are communicating with much of anyone from the secular world? Almost nobody. And so you're actually sometimes communicating with someone from salon.com who's trolling the website to find some cool material to talk about how crazy we are, maybe. But as a general rule, we're not communicating with the secular world in Christian media. So, the outrage machine that people talk about, I think a lot of that is motivated by the fact that those who are concerned with religious liberty issues look at a Christian world that is largely indifferent to them. And so what you're trying to do is say to people who are largely indifferent, unwilling to even risk the disapproval of their peers. So what were the three things? The power of the blood, the blood of Christ, the power of their testimony, and they did not love their life even to the point of death. We're talking to a Christian community that gets the power of the blood, gets the testimony, confessional culture, but won't even risk a disapproving glance in a cubicle. Okay, so there's no power there. And so a lot of that is trying to get people to understand what's at stake. So I understand from that standpoint, and I know that's not to excuse false reporting. Nobody excuses that. I don't think anyone would defend that. But I think a lot of the temperature is, hey guys, this is a really big deal. And every Christian ministry that's trying to get Christians to focus on an issue does this. Nobody comes to World Vision and says, hey, you guys need to stop scolding the Christian community about not being sufficiently concerned for the poor. Everybody agrees that World Vision should do that. Right. But then I hear again and again, hey, you guys, you need to stop being so hysterical about abortion or marriage or whatever. And I'm thinking, not so much. On the other side, where do we actually communicate in a secular world? Right. And that is where we have a real issue.
It's a real problem. Yeah.
Who's doing it? Who's doing it?
I agree. And let me say that when I kind of opened at the beginning, my intent or desire is that Christian media, which I'm assuming this room is populated with, would help Christians to care about the three things that I talked about, about engaging culture, about creating culture, and ultimately about defending within culture. So I think I'm with you. There's not a lot of culture. Well, we're all culture creators in this sense, but we're not necessarily creating culture that's impacting the broader culture outside of evangelicalism. So I'm with you, but I think that's our responsibility is to hold forth, to use Warren's term, kind of a story and imagination that shows that we should do discerningly. And I could be wrong, I don't think anyone here, at least up here, is saying you don't speak into, that there are alarm bells that need to be sounded. And I actually think I disagree with you. I think a lot of people would defend the faux controversies because they keep doing them over and over again. But what I would say is I think there are real issues, and people like you and us around here, we need to hold those up. There are real religious liberty concerns right now, and I think we can speak into them. and say, Christians, here's how we encourage you to engage culture. I think that's important. That's my missiology background. I think there's things to create it. That's probably not us in creating culture that's going to be more broad, right? So that might be an Eric Metaxas or whatever, VeggieTales, whatever. But I think ultimately, yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think we're all with you. We've got to speak into it winsomely and firmly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a ton of questions and a ton of issues that I can't fully address. I would, though, say this about Christian media and who we speak to. That is the fact that we speak mostly to Christians is kind of a pathology of our time, right? I mean, is that we live in a fragmented culture. We live in especially in media, it's fragmented to the point of atomized, you might even say, and there's not a lot I fear that we can do about that. I would, however, say on the other hand that at World, at least, we understand that we're speaking mostly to Christians, but what we do think we are speaking to are Christian leaders. We're speaking to moms that homeschool their children. We're speaking to pastors. We're speaking to, to folks who go off to the workplace every day. And we take very seriously our responsibility of giving them the language and giving them the stories that they will need to be more effective in their spheres of influence. So while it is true that we do speak mostly to the Christian world, I still think that most of what we say still applies because we're listening to each other. And the best arguments still, I think, will win. And the best stories will get retold. And if we can provide that language and those stories, even to folks that might be fellow Christians, they'll when they stop facing us and turn and face the people in their worlds, I think that they will be more empowered to do what God has called them to do.
David, I think you had some terrific points there. I sometimes share your, wake up. Why aren't you doing that? I mean, obviously it's something. But I also share what Ed said is that sometimes we're waking people up and making them care about things that at the end of the day are irrelevant. The other thing that struck me too, two other thoughts that came to mind. And I hope they're not too random to make some sense. One is that one of the ways that culture impacts Christian media is in our standards of success. And what I mean by that is, I think, and this is something we've got to shake off, not only do we need to say, what does God want my message to be? We need to ask, what does God want my medium to be? We need to ask, what does God want my measures of success to be? And this goes to we can generate a lot of page views and a lot of Twitter, retweets and a lot of likes on Facebook and use that as the measure of success. My friend Greg Fleming down in New Zealand, you've probably been down there, 4 million people in this country. He leads a big Christian think tank, and he can't maintain his organization in a Christian subculture because it doesn't exist down there. And the challenge for us is we can have a large audience and sustain ourselves financially and measure ourselves with increased likes and think we're making a difference in the larger culture. And it goes to kind of Christian music, right? Is popularity the definition of a good song? These are all questions I think we need to do maybe a little bit more work at. What is biblical success when it comes to this? That said, too, I want to bring up one more thing. I have been struck, and Pope Francis is an enigma to me. Sometimes I love what he says and does, and sometimes I'm like, what does he mean by that? In fact, a lot of times, right? I'm sure you are too. I think he's such an interesting guy. But what struck me is it hasn't taken much for the larger secular culture to like him. Now, I think they're assuming things about him that aren't true, or if they are true, big problems, right? That he's going to change his view on homosexual behavior or something like that. If he does that, obviously we've got problems. And I think he's evidenced it both ways, and I just don't know. He's an enigma. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, actually. But to me, it's interesting how a single act of kindness and generosity and hope and love can be done and even can be led with, and how it actually can be heard. It can actually speak outside of the culture. Now, you've seen enough of Breakpoint in the Colson Center to know we're not going to wuss out on defending the things that we think really matter. But I'm wondering at what level, I mean, our founder, Chuck Colson, I think evidenced this. He was able to say harder things to the culture than others. He still got thrown under the bus sometimes and still called the Nixon hatchet man 30 years after it was relevant and so on. But because he went and helped a whole lot of prisoners, he actually did it. You couldn't say, oh, you preach too much and you don't care for the downcast, because he did both. And I'm wondering, too, in the creation of culture, how much green space there is for Christians to work in solving problems. For example, we know we need to stand up against things that are going to restrict religious liberty. But we've got 2 European parliamentarians right now wanting to ban pornography in their entire country. These aren't Christians. They're secularist. And this is what we know about secularism. It runs dry. It always cashes out, right, of a bank account and never puts anything back in. It always serves the immediate moment. And that's the case. Maybe the church could rebuild marriage, not just by protecting religious liberty, but by also helping sexually addicted, sexually broken people. At some point, we're going to have to call it sexual brokenness. We're going to have to say, that's broken, right? But I think in a rebuilding mindset rather than a defending mindset, or maybe a both, and we've got to be known for both of those messages as well.
Well, I think that's right, John. And I think one of the reasons that we're seeing the needle move, for example, on the abortion issue in this country with young people is because of the 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 pregnancy care centers that are scattered out all across America. It's not just the public activism. Is that in every town, city, village, and burg across America, there are real people quietly, faithfully putting hands and feet to the gospel.
What if we told those stories too? Those stories. I think that's a task. You talk about the false outrage. What if we erred on the side of false hope? And just erred on the side of these kind of great stories of people doing.
Well, at the risk of shameless self-promotion here, we do tell those stories at World. We've got
Hope, wasn't shameless at all.
Awards,
you were going right there.
Hope Awards for Effective Compassion tell those stories of these grassroots ministries. We also, about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, started what we called a marriage longevity series. We just profiled married couples that had been married for at least 35 years. And some of those married couples had gone through, in fact, I would say all of them. If you've been married, I've been married 30 years. If you've been married 35 years, you've been through some ups and downs, right? And telling the truth about those marriages, but also how God has sustained those marriages through the years, we thought was an important part of that storytelling process.
I would just suggest that you see it as a two-step process. Your audience is primarily Christian, okay? We're in a world that's lost, that's not hearing the message, and you can't necessarily reach them. I listen to Christian radio for one reason. I'm garnering as much information as I can to share in my daily walk. The world's going crazy, and we can shake our fist at these folks that are out there making these laws and whatever. The fact of the matter is they're lost. In real numbers, there's some hard research that's pretty amazing to me, in that it sounds like there's something like 30 million of us that really know the Lord in America today. About 30 million of us. I mean, we all have different numbers, but whatever that number is, there are hard statistics that say that over 80% of the unchurched today have at least one person in their life that they trust who is a Christian, who is going to church on a regular basis. We have the opportunity. Over 80% of the unchurched, I think it's 71% of the unchurched say they're likely to accept an invitation to church if somebody would invite them, if a Christian would invite them. Yet less than 2% of us invited anybody to church last year. So there's this gap. How are they going to know unless somebody tells them? How is somebody going to tell them unless they go? But it comes back to it. Somebody's got to send us. And so I would just suggest here that with all the wonderful things you're doing, your message should just not be edifying to the church. It should be edifying and then sending, a sending message. Help us, encourage all of us as lay people to take this wonderful information that you're providing us and encourage us, because most Christians don't realize that. Most Christians feel no sense of responsibility for sharing it, and yet we have that influence. And if Christian media would start looking at that and say, go, everybody, we need to go out into the world and preach the gospel. It is the salt that's been trodden under the foot of man. We've lost our saltiness. And we have decades-old Christians that are sitting there wondering, what on earth is going on? And yet we have the knowledge. We need to be sent. So keep feeding. I would just say, guys, keep doing what you're doing it really well, but just add to it. Our message is to equip you for ministry, and you go into the world and preach this message and do it in ways that are acceptable. I'll just tell you one anecdote right quick. We were just at a meeting, and there's a fellow running for governor in New York. He's a Christian in a like a 90% Democratic area. And that county has voted the governor in. Every governor that's been elected in the last 30 years has been elected in that area. It's just right outside of New York City. I'm forgetting what the county is, but he said, I talked to him personally. I said, how do you communicate the message when you say you feel exactly the way we do, and yet Democrats are electing you overwhelmingly, and that's why they're now saying you need to be running for governor. He said, I go right into the pit. I go right to him. I sit there and I just explain. And he says, we have the truth on our side. Mm-hmm. And when I started to explain, they might not agree with me, but now they're understanding how to do it. So I just say, just encourage us to go, encourage us as lay people to go into the world and communicate in rational ways and practical ways the truths that you folks are supplying.
That's a trajectory issue, and I think it's so true, because I think the problem that you've identified there of kind of Christianity is for me and it's for my edification, and it's not turning the inside out. I look at some of the great cultural moments that have moved the needle in a good way or that have changed things, and it really it seems to me it's not coming from pastors and it's not coming from politicians. It's coming from professionals. It's coming from business professionals. It's coming from medical professionals. It's coming from people who are entrepreneurial. I sat down just this past week for an hour and a half with a guy in my church who's a baker, owns a great bakery there in Colorado Springs. He's a little nervous because of what happened up the road in Denver, and he wants to know what he does. And he started to describe it, and he's like, how do I deal with this? And he's lived out his Christian faith in his business. He's got a 4-year track record of doing it. And what's going to happen is someone's going to challenge him on the same-sex marriage issue, and they're not going to know this whole track record. And I think the more we can turn, I think the Acton Institute's a great example of a group that's mobilizing entrepreneurs and business leaders to go and kind of take their faith through their work and through their business. Spent some time on the phone with Pinnacle Forum, Steve Fedeschi. I think he's doing the same thing, I think there's some wonderful examples of this, and those are good stories to tell as well. I think, though, you've identified something that's even bigger than Christian media. It's a church issue where kind of the motto of church is come and see, come and see, come and see, instead of come in here and we'll equip you to go and proclaim and go and live. It's kind of inside out.
It is bigger than just the media, though I would like to reclaim the media to a certain extent as a biblical and Christian vocation, an important part of that process. One of the things that has energized my life and my sense of calling as a Christian journalist is Genesis chapter 2, where God told Adam to go name the animals in the garden. In my view, this process of naming the animals rightly, of looking into the true nature of what's going on in our world and calling it by its right name, telling the right kinds of stories about it, is absolutely a biblical mandate. And then you look all the way to the other end of the Bible, to Revelation, and you realize when you read the first chapter of Revelation, that the reason we have the book of Revelation is because Jesus told John to write down what you see. John is basically a reporter of this vision that God has given him. So I really believe that, yes, there's the preaching of the word, there's the fellowship of the saints, there's the sacraments, there's all of that, and those should be essential to our lives as individuals. I don't think we should put this noble biblical exercise and enterprise of Christian journalism and Christian media on a second shelf when it comes to talking about Christian vocations.
We need to wrap this up. I've got to go catch a flight. Ed's got to go catch another event. It's been an interesting conversation. Ed, I want to give you the last word, and I'll give you the last word. Let you sneak out of here because you got to go to something else, and then we'll close up after you go.
I don't really have anything brilliant to say. I would say you guys know much more about media, and the people in this room know much more about media than I do. I liked how, by the way, you turned John into a reporter. That was awesome. I turned back to Paul. And I think that Paul's a missiologist. You're a reporter. I'm a missiologist. So we'll take our biblical apostles and run with them. I do think that we're trying to figure out how to engage our culture and our context, and that's something Christians have struggled with for 2,000 years. Particularly, and I might add that we have historically more mistakes than successes when we look across the 2,000 years of history, engaging new cultures. We just didn't expect to engage the new culture while we were still living in it. In other words, if we go and you go to the Pokot in Africa, the Quechua in the highlands of Peru, you expect to learn new ways. I think we're going to have to learn how to relate to our culture anew, because in the last 10 years, the level of cultural shift is remarkable. I don't think any of us would have guessed 10 years ago the conversations we're having now. I do think that we can look to others. You mentioned New Zealand, which has the lowest identification in the English-speaking world of Christians. And I think we can maybe learn some. Canada, for example, how are Christians wrestling through that in a post-culture war era? I think that every cultural indicator except the pro-life indicator is going in a direction that would be against the values that most Christians hold. We're going to be to the place where we have a minority status. Part of that being a minority status is speaking up for and into issues of religious liberty. That's why it's the first freedom. Part of that is being biblically faithful to the gospel. I just think Christian media can be a big part in helping Christians to think biblically and winsomely in the culture where we find ourselves.
One of the things that the Colson Center is really committed to is keeping this conversation alive, because we know we need to do it, and we don't yet know how we need to do it. And if we're not willing to look at ourselves and go, hey, you know what? We need to change what we're doing. We need to alter what we're doing. Then we're not being honest, right? We need to be able to have these conversations. We can't have them isolated. We need to have them with each other. One of the values that Chuck brought in my life and also to the Colson Center is collaboration and work. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation, not from the Colson Center, but from the Colson Center, Lifeway Research, World Magazine. I could have invited, again, several of you to be up here as well, and I wanted this to be a conversation. We're in this together. I think Ed is right. It's been a remarkable shift. It's a remarkable shift, though, that a lot of people predicted 50 years ago. You can go back and read Schaeffer. You can go back and read Leslie Newbegin. I mean, these guys were talking about this. It's post-Christian, and now we're kind of seeing the outplays of that. And it's going to require, I think, some new thinking, and maybe some old thinking made new again, or something like that. Warren, anything else to add?
Well, just since we're sharing websites, the World Magazine's website is worldmag.com. World News Group, which also publishes a number of websites and several radio programs, is WNG for World News Group, WNG.org. I guess I would just want to close, John, with a quote that I learned again from you, from Robert Weber, the theologian who died a few years ago, late of Wheaton College, who said the most pressing spiritual question of our day is who gets to narrate the world? Who gets to narrate the world? And I think that if he's right, and I think he is, that we need to take our responsibilities for biblical storytelling to step up and narrate the world in ways that are consistent with a biblical worldview, a Christian understanding of the world, or the other side is going to control the narrative.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Warren. Thanks for joining the conversation.